This episode is brought to you by Disney's Mufasa, The Lion King. Get tickets now for the ultimate family holiday movie experience. Reunite with the characters you know and the untold story you'd never expect. Witness Mufasa's rise from orphan to king and see how the legendary villain Scar got his name. Disney's Mufasa, The Lion King, in theaters everywhere this Friday. The kingdom awaits.
Hi, everybody. It's Deesha. The following is a member bonus episode of Ursa Short Fiction. We're excited to share this free teaser, but if you'd like to listen to the whole thing, become an Ursa member today in Apple Podcasts or at ursastory.com/join. You'll help us keep this show going and get access to exclusive episodes. That's ursastory.com/join. Thanks for your support.
And I chose my agent, PJ Mark, because his editorial note to me, the note that changed everything, was forget about Nev, fuck Nev. This is Opal's story.
Hey, Dawnie.
Hi, Deesha.
And welcome everyone to Ursa Short Fiction, where we geek out on our favorite short stories and writers. I'm Deesha Philyaw, author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
And I'm Dawnie Walton, author of the final revival of Opal and Nev.
As always, this show is supported by you, our listeners. Become an Ursa member today by going to Apple Podcasts or ursastory.com/join. You'll get exclusive episodes and you'll help us keep making this show. Now, today, I'm excited for this episode for a couple of reasons. One is that we're sharing a brand new series that we're calling First Chapters. Yes, we know this show is called Ursa Short Fiction, and usually we're all about short stories, but every once in a while, we like to show a little love to that little underappreciated form of literature, the novel. And because Dawnie and I get to make our own rules, we want to occasionally talk about novels. And specifically, we want to do a deep dive into memorable first chapters. This brings me to the second reason I'm excited. We finally get to dedicate an episode to talking with Dawnie about the making of her brilliant novel, The Final Revival of Opal and Nev.
I'm just blushing. I'm like hot all over. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited.
I think I own more copies of The Final Revival of Opal and Nev than any other book. And I think like Jamila Minnick's Moonrise over New Jessup is second because I just got another copy of hers as a gift. But I think I have like 5 copies of yours in addition to the audiobook, which is a whole experience of itself. So I am so hyped for this episode. And we're going to dive into it. We're going to read a little bit from the first chapter and get all the details from you, Dawnie, on how this chapter became the springboard for the rest of this just groundbreaking and one-of-a-kind work. So, Dawnie, for the 5 people who don't know about the final revival of Opal and Nev, can you give them a little synopsis on what the novel is about?
Sure. And you think I would have been better at this, but it's been a while, so I'm going to try my best. Okay. So the novel is about an interracial sort of proto-punk duo who start making music together in the early 1970s. There is Opal Jewel, who's a Black woman from Detroit, and there's Nev Charles, who's a white Englishman. So they're sort of like an odd pairing. But it's about how they kind of have a very flash in the pan moment in 1971 through a performance that leads to a devastating event, a news event that puts them in the headlines. And it's about how everything kind of falls apart after that. And there's 2 timelines in the story. There's the timeline that follows that action in the early 1970s, but really there's the present storyline because it's told in the form of an oral history. They're being interviewed in 2016. So they're telling that story as they're also preparing for a reunion at a Coachella-style festival. Woo!
Amazing. So a story within a story within a story.
Yes, basically.
And all of these incredible voices. Can you tell us how you came to write this story and, you know, this sort of set your path as the beginning of your journey as an author?
Sure. So my journey started mad late. I had a whole career before I was a fiction writer. I worked in magazines. I was an editor, much like Sunny Shelton, who is the character who is doing the interviews and sort of like filtering it through her editor's notes and her own personal biases and attachments to these characters. And you know, I was working in magazines, and around 2015 or so, I started to see the writing on the wall with media. I had gotten to the point where I was an executive level editor. I was working at Essence Magazine, kind of, you know, of course, an iconic brand, dream job. But my job became a lot less about the things that I got into journalism for. I wasn't really writing, I was not editing, and it became a lot about like budget management and, you know, head count and all these things. Magazines were really struggling, and I was at a point in my life also personally where I was ready to make some major changes. And I had this story of these two oddball characters. I used to think of them as Grace Jones and David Bowie, right? And thinking, oh God, what if they had made music together in this era of New York City that I'm really fascinated by? And it always seemed to me that they did somehow, and I just missed it because it seemed like they should have been collaborating. So finally, you know, I remember it very vividly. I think it was like Christmas 2013. And I just was home alone, and it was cold in New York. It was hibernation season for me because I don't really love the cold weather. I
Floridian, fellow Floridian, I understand.
And Opal's voice just started kind of like pouring out of me. And I just sat at the computer, and I just was like, for the first time really in my attempts at fiction writing, I was just doing it because I felt it. And not doing it because it was like, I'm going to write a short story. I'm going to try to write a novel. It was just trying to like get down this voice that I found to be so real and funny and provocative. And that's how I started doing it. And eventually I did decide that I was going to try to see what I could do with these pages that I was writing. And the first thing that happened was like a miracle, which is that I got into the MacDowell, which is a residency in New Hampshire, where so many amazing people, including James Baldwin, have spent time doing their work. And that was sort of the first kind of validating step, you know, that was like, maybe I can pivot to this. And I had spent so many years along the straight and narrow and kind of diligently climbing up that ladder that I had never really given myself a chance to do the things that I really, truly in my heart dreamed about. And so it was a really empowering moment. I mean, I will say that I also, like, I'm not an impetuous person. So I had like some money saved in the bank account, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I have this safety net to fall back on, and I have all these safeguards, but let me at least try so that I don't have this regret that I didn't. And just one thing led to another. You know, I ended up going to grad school, moved to Iowa from New York City, lived there for 2 years, and made it a mission to finish writing this book during that time. And I did. And here we are.
And we are so thankful that this is the gem that you brought to fruition. You said something about the voices, you know, starting with the voices and the musicality of the, you know, it's a book about music and musicians, but there's musicality in the language, and it's present right out of the gate in this first chapter. And we hear it in Opal's inflections and her style of speech. There's a certain rhythm. Even when she's recounting who her father and her sister Pearl's father, who they are, who those men were, and then Pearl recounts it. I thought to myself, this is like dueling banjos. They have this, like these dueling narratives, but there's so much rhythm, and again, the word that comes to mind is sort of musicality, and that's present there in that chapter. Can we hear a little bit of that first
goodness
chapter?
Yeah, let me grab. And I have to say, so I did kind of a cheat. So the official, what's marked as chapter 1 is the first part of the oral history, right?
Okay.
But even before that, there is an editor's note from Sunny Shelton. But yeah, I think this is great. I'd love to talk about them together because I think both of them together are sort of chapter 1. Thank you so much for what you said about the rhythm. Rhythm in the language of whatever I'm writing is very important to me. And it feels like a gut thing. Whenever the thing I'm working on now, I print it out again and again, and I sort of I check every line, and if it's not if it doesn't have a certain bounce to it, it's hard to say, why it doesn't, but I know when it doesn't. And so I will just very precisely edit those lines again and again. But the novel I'm working on now has a more traditional narration. With this, it was like writing these characters so raw on the page. And Opal especially, I just knew her voice and I knew her rhythm right away. And when I was doing edits later, it was so interesting that I was like, oh, I'm not going to take that edit because she would never say that, or she would never say that in this particular way. And so it was just kind of like some weird force. But I'm just going to read maybe just the first thing that Opal says in the book, because these are literally the first words, the first 2 paragraphs that I wrote of the book, and it never changed. It never changed. So this is Opal talking to the journalist, Sunny, about her growing up with her sister in Detroit. My sister Pearl and I grew up in Detroit. Our mother was Ruby Robinson. That's right. She was Ruby, and she named her daughters Pearl and Opal. Since I was old enough to remember, Mama worked at the GM plant on Clark Street, but not on the assembly line. She was in the cafeteria, slopping it out to the men as fast as she could when that bell rang for lunch. If one or the other of us was sick and couldn't go to school, Mama would sneak us in and stack up potato sacks to make a pallet on the floor of the pantry, and she'd leave the door cracked so we could see out, and so she could keep an eye on us too. On those sick days, if I managed to doze off, I'd wake right on up at noontime. The stampede, darling. From where I was, watching out the sliver of that cracked pantry door, I could only see feet. The backs of Mama's white nursing shoes. I don't know why the hell she wore those white shoes. Every night she had to use a chewed up old toothbrush to scrub the drops of gravy and sauce and whatever else off them. And then, facing Mama and lined up to get their grub, those rowdy men in their steel-toe boots. That's all I could see, but I could hear all kinds of stuff. Even then I could pick out a sound and tune out the rest. If I wanted to, I could focus and hear the forks scraping against the plates or the wet noises of mouths opening and closing. When they were all lined up, I could hear the men rapping to Mama, flirting. And then I'd hear the craziest thing, Mama laughing and flirting right back.
And I could hear, I have Opal's voice in my head. So established so clearly early on. So very clearly.
Thank you. And the thing, I feel like, she grew up in Detroit, but I always like to say, I feel like all Black people are Southern because of the Great Migration and those roots. And so, knowing and planting in the book also that Opal's people are from Alabama, but she's a city girl. But those inflections and that rhythm, I was very much drawing on the voices that I knew growing up down south.
Thanks for listening to this sneak preview of our latest member bonus episode. To hear the rest of it, become an Ursa member in Apple Podcasts or by going to ursastory.com/join.